Sonic is an interesting franchise for a lot of reasons, but one of the most notable to me is the franchise's emphasis on story. It's not a plot-driven series or anything, but when you compare it to its contemporaries, it's very clear that they put a lot more effort into the personalities and plot lines than something like Mario has. And as a result of that, a lot of people, me included, care a lot about these characters and these stories. So I wanted to take a look at all the stories that Sonic Team has delivered to us over the years and see which ones are the best and which ones are the worst. There are some ground rules we do have to go over real quick, first of which is what games I'm going to be covering. The first rule I implemented is that a game had to have enough unique story for me to want to cover it. Sonic 1 and 2 are plot light enough that I decided to skip over them, and the DS ports of the Wii games are similar enough to the main console versions that I didn't feel like covering them separately. I also didn't want to go over every single Sonic game that has ever released, because that would include things like Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, and that's just not what this is about. Unfortunately, there's not really a good guide as to what games I should or shouldn't talk about. It's not clear what is a mainline Sonic game, and apparently everything is canon, so I had to come up with my own bullshit rules for what games I should cover. I decided to only talk about platformers, so if you're not running around and jumping on stuff in the game, I won't be talking about it here. This is really good because it means I don't have to talk about Sonic Chronicles, baby! Let's go! Dodged it again! Seriously though, that game is so boring, holy shit. Anyway, the last thing I have to say is that, unfortunately, I was not able to play all of these games myself. I played as many of them as I could, and I don't have every gaming console available to me, and probably couldn't afford a copy of every single one of these games anyway. While I do think I'll end up losing some of the nuance here, I assure you I did as much research as I could on these games to try and get around this deficiency. With all of that out of the way, we should probably just go ahead and get started, with the absolute worst story in any Sonic game going to... How? Just how? How do you make something this bad in the year 2017? I can sort of understand weird story decisions from games like Shadow the Hedgehog or Sonic 06 because they were relatively early on, but at this point, they definitely should have known better. I think this line is like a mistranslation or something, but I still feel we need to talk about it because there is nothing that sums up the aesthetic gesture of Sonic Force's story more than hearing the characters talk about how Sonic has been tortured for several months, only to cut to Sonic and have him acting completely normal and joking like nothing happened. It's just such a perfect example of how this game loves to pretend to be dramatic and important, but absolutely refuses to engage with the reality of any of the ideas it's tossing around. I'd go as far to say that this game is, in my mind, the exact antithesis of good Sonic storytelling. Sonic is a kid's franchise at the end of the day, and no matter what anyone tells you, it is not supposed to be extremely dramatic or dark and gritty. However, that doesn't mean that it can't deal with heavy topics at all. I think the best children's media are the stories that try to make complex ideas and emotions easier for kids to understand. I mean, if you were to ask me what the best movies I watched as a kid were, I'd probably bring up things like The Lion King or the first two Kung Fu Panda movies. These are movies that talk about grief and trauma and a lot of other heavy topics, but in a way that's appropriate for children, and that's a really important and surprisingly difficult thing to do right. Sonic Forces is the exact opposite of this. It wants to act like it's a mature and edgy game in a way that makes it feel completely inappropriate for a kid's franchise, but it doesn't commit to any of the emotions or themes at all. Hey, did you want to have a discussion about grief or trauma in this gritty take on Sonic where Eggman declares war on the entire world? Well, too fucking bad. No one, and I mean literally no one, even gets injured in a meaningful way on screen, let alone a character getting killed off. Instead, the game is just about the power of friendship or whatever, which is not only the theme of every other Sonic game, but it isn't even being used in an interesting way here. There is no emotional depth to any of the characters in this game outside of Infinite if you're willing to stretch that far for something interesting. But we still have all these awful lines about the horrors of war, despite no horrors being shown. Even the potentially good ideas in the story get completely wasted. Showing Green Hill Zone being devastated by the war is a really good way of establishing just how dire the situation has become. But the game can't even commit to that because that would require taking any of its plot elements seriously for even a second. We can't show Sonic being upset about something for even a second, obviously. We can't imply that Sonic has emotions or thoughts outside of go fast. Instead, let's just have him say the worst quip in the entire franchise.
Green Hill's looking a lot more like Sand Hill right now.
It has lost literally the most important part of this kind of story and only kept the parts that don't work in a Sonic game. It is exactly the opposite of what you are supposed to do. It is so ass. Even outside of choosing the worst possible direction for a Sonic game story, the story in this game is also riddled with what I can only describe as a mix of a lack of polish and basic incompetence. Infinite's backstory is completely fucked. There are lines implying that he was created by Eggman, but the official story is that he was a mercenary that got his ass beat by Shadow and decided to make that his entire personality, so that's completely inconsistent. I don't think there's even a single good line in the entire script. Every character is somehow completely out of character with their previous appearances, while also not having a personality at all. They're all as wooden as a forest, but any personality they do have is just completely wrong. The cutscenes are as bad as SA1 in some ways, but without the charm of being early video game CGI. Like, seriously, what are these fight scenes? Why do they look like this? This game's story isn't just a failure, it's a failure that should not have happened. Sonic Team has just had too many opportunities to learn this lesson already. The fact that they would make this exact same mistake again makes me feel like they just don't really have a direction for the story of this franchise anymore. Oh yeah, also the Avatar character is a stupid idea that shouldn't have happened. Okay, next. Rise of Lyric is a Sonic Boom property from before they knew what they wanted to do with this part of the franchise, and it really shows. The Boom spin-offs would eventually find their footing as an actually funny, more lighthearted and comedic side of the franchise, and that's a direction that I'll stress throughout this video that I think works for Sonic conceptually. Unfortunately, Rise of Lyric has basically none of the comedic wit or energy that makes the show or even the other Boom games tolerable. Rise of Lyric takes itself painfully seriously, purely to its own detriment. While there are a few comedic moments here and there, a huge number of scenes are played completely straight, and even the more comedic scenes just aren't that funny anyway. Overall, these incarnations of the characters just don't work outside of that comedic context. Knuckles being kind of dumb isn't used to good enough effect, and he just feels more annoying than anything. Sonic's cockiness isn't an interesting character flaw or a good source of comedy here, and Amy and Tails are just kind of boring without their eccentricities being more exaggerated. Also, Shadow is just awful. He's not quite going full comedic edgelord yet, but also isn't here to say anything interesting, and that kind of sums up the characterization of every cast member here, actually. They don't really resemble their normal selves, but they aren't exaggerated enough to be funny. I think in the entire game, the only joke that got a laugh out of me is the bit where Sonic and Tails explained the complicated time travel plot to the robot, and then the robot was like, that makes sense, and then Sonic was like, it does? I thought that was kind of cute. That made me laugh. The other jokes are mildly amusing at best, I guess. The plot is just a nothing burger. Lyric is another ancient evil that gets unleashed upon the world, except it's not as conceptually interesting as something like Chaos or Dark Gaia, because instead of being a primordial being that represents the very forces of nature and ties into the lore of the world, he's just Eggman with less swag. Lyric isn't as fun or even more intimidating than Eggman is anyway, and because this is set in another universe, the lore tying him to the ancients isn't as interesting to me. It could have been interesting if the game developed it, but we barely spend any time on it. We barely spend any meaningful time on anything in this game, really, but it somehow still has more cutscenes than basically every Sonic game outside of Sonic 06. And Sonic 06 only takes that long because you have to watch the same cutscenes from multiple perspectives anyway. That leads to the ultimate crime of Rise of Lyric. It's boring. It is painfully boring, which is a real shame because I feel like it's coming close to something cool. The animation on the characters in these cutscenes is largely good, much better than what the rest of the franchise has been pumping out, and the writing isn't bad, it just doesn't go anywhere. I think the best example of this is the hook that the game uses to draw you into the story. When you start the game, it cuts to Sonic getting attacked by Lyric and falling into this big hole with rubble falling on top of him, with all of his friends looking on in shock. Then we cut to a black screen with the words, "Yesterday." Okay, that's kind of an interesting hook. Sonic gets hurt in the near future. What causes that? What's the setup here? Well, it turns out that what happened is that after Sonic and his friends go and get all the MacGuffins, Lyric threatens Sonic with a bunch of robots that don't even look that threatening, and then Sonic's friends give up the MacGuffins in order to save Sonic's life. But then, Lyric just shoots Sonic anyway, and we get the initial scene. And then he just gets up like nothing's wrong. Seriously, it doesn't even seem like he's that badly hurt. This entire setup was literally just a waste of time. Lyric could have just stolen the crystals or whatever from them, and the plot would not have changed. And that's the common theme of a lot of the storytelling in Rise of Lyric. You get a kind of interesting idea introduced, only for the game to waste a ton of your time and not develop that idea at all. The end result is a story that feels incredibly plotting and is overall just an unpleasant experience to get through. While there are games above this that offended me more with their writing, this game still annoys me more because it took up so much of my goddamn time. There is not a single other Sonic game that wastes this much of your time with cutscenes without at least actually telling an interesting story. Not necessarily a good story or a great story, but an interesting one at the very least. I know this game had a really troubled development, and apparently Sega really screwed over Big Red Button a lot while they were making this game, but that doesn't change the fact that the product we received is just not it. You know, I knew people in the fandom complained a lot about the writing of Pontac and Graf, and I still think a lot of that is people looking for a scapegoat for the overall direction of the franchise at this time not being to their liking, but after having actually gone through all the story in these games and their cutscenes, I'm kinda shocked by just how bad they actually were. I knew the Zeddies' designs sucked, they looked like Yo Gabba Gabba characters, and I assumed that's why people didn't like them, but they're actually just completely unbearable. These guys have like negative personality, and I don't know why they thought this was a good idea at any level. It honestly feels a bit insulting, like Sega thought so little of their audience's intelligence that they designed characters for toddlers when they were trying to appeal to 10-year-olds. Like, I know 10-year-olds are dumb, but they're not this dumb. Come on, guys. All of the returning cast is mediocre to bad in this game. Eggman is the least bad, as he's just kind of a smug jerk, and that's at least close to what Eggman is supposed to be. He's not particularly fun or intimidating, but at least he works. Sonic and Tails are way worse than normal. Sonic's arc about not running off and getting into trouble is done in the worst way possible, where he's just kind of an idiot. It's not done in any sort of nuanced way. He's just super impulsive and not competent enough to make up for it, which is such a surface level flaw, it feels more appropriate for Boom than it does mainline Sonic. Tails is just really, really boring here. He's not fun or cool, he's competent enough, I guess, but he keeps picking fights over stupid bullshit because the writers wanted to do a character arc in this game, but couldn't find a way to have the characters get into a meaningful conflict. So instead, they just had Tails get super defensive about working with Eggman for the dumbest reasons imaginable. Amy and Knuckles are technically in this game. That's about all you could say about them. The bit where Amy is like, "I never got to tell you how I feel," does drive home that the people who wrote this game were not familiar with the franchise and does suck, but that's really the only notable thing she says in the entire game. Sonic's interactions with the Zeddy are also just painful. Maybe it's just me, but Sonic comes off like such a dick here. He makes fun of Xena for like being a girl, basically. Like, wow, she cares about makeup, she does girl things, lol. My name is Sonic the Hedgehog and I hate women. But in his defense, what is he supposed to say here? It's like when a stand-up comedian tries to work with a crowd and they just don't give him anything usable. The Zeddy have so little personality that Sonic can't riff off of them at all. He can only make surface level comments about their appearance. Instead of getting a normal back and forth between him and Eggman, we get Sonic making fat jokes about the yellow one because his only character traits are fat and stupid. Every one of these interactions is a waste of time, and the game is worse off for their inclusion. That's a thought process you can extend to most of this game's story, actually. I genuinely think that the more of this plot that could have removed, the better the game would have been. Mario Galaxy purposely had very bare bones plot, and that worked fine for what that game was trying to be. If you're gonna copy everything from that game anyway, either copy that aspect too, or actually put effort into the story you're trying to tell. The only reason, and I want to stress the only reason this game is above Rise of Lyric, is that its story elements take up significantly less time, so it's easier to ignore them. I'd rather watch a train wreck for 20 minutes than watch paint dry for 2 hours, so at least this game wasted less of my precious remaining time on this planet. I'm still not sure if I hate Colors or Lost World Story more, but at least this game doesn't have the Zeddy in it. Anyway, this one also sucks. I am once again in shock at just how unpleasant these cutscenes actually are. Lost World's cutscenes are bad, but they didn't make me anywhere near as uncomfortable as some of Sonic Colors' worst segments are. The writers here just refuse to let a joke die for some reason. There are multiple scenes where they tell an okay joke, but then instead of moving on, they just riff on it like 3 more times, and I have no idea why they thought that was okay.
You know, I don't like what you're doing to my friends in there. It's messed up. So I'm gonna mess you up. Yeah, that's right. I'm stretching. You got a problem with that? I want to be able to fully enjoy taking you apart without some pulled muscle slowing me down. Okay, now I'm ready. Of course, if you want to run away, please feel free. There's no shame in it. Well, maybe a little shame. You guys don't talk much, do you? Fair enough. Don't say I didn't warn you.
I'm kind of shocked the whole no copyright law in the universe is going to stop me thing got so much traction, because it's not even close to the worst joke in this game, and it's way less emphasized than the other jokes are. And the fact that the humor is just completely cringe-inducing is pretty important, because the humor is all that this game's story has. The plot is essentially non-existent outside of a few scenes that completely fail for their own reasons. One of the only major plot points is Eggman brainwashing Tails, and that literally gets resolved in that exact same scene. It's not even like a setup for a boss fight. At least Tails getting turned into a cyborg in Lost World served to show how resourceful he was. The scene in Colors is just glorified exposition. There are also a lot of scenes that feel like the voice direction or script or something fell through. I mean, look at this scene with Tails.
Oh, there you are. I thought I lost you for a second. Did you find anything interesting? Look at all of them. He's captured thousands of aliens.
Don't worry. We'll get them out.
Sonic?
This may not seem like that bad of a scene, but this line read is just all wrong. Based on the script and the camera direction, what seems to be going on here is that Tails is starting a sentence all chipper and happy, but then trails off when he sees what Eggman is doing to the Wisps and is horrified by it. If I were to try to write a character having that exact same reaction, this type of sentence structure with the ellipsis is exactly how I would go about doing it. That's the implication in like comics or whenever a character's line is written out this way. But apparently the voice actor never got this memo, and I don't know where the problem came from, but this scene feels entirely wrong. There's not really much more to talk about with Color's story. It's an excuse plot. The story is not a focus here, and that's very obvious. It serves only to entertain the player in between the action of the actual gameplay. I just wish it didn't suck at that. Man, do I really have to do this? Sonic 06 has been a punching bag on the internet for so long that I don't really get any joy out of mocking it anymore. Sure, learning that the silver fights can softlock your game or whatever is funny the first time you see it, but after hearing about it for the 100th time, there's just nothing worth saying about it anymore. The story gets mocked a lot too, and I agree with most of the criticism, but this is still the first game in this ranking where there are some ideas that I actually kind of like. Shadow's story has some fun moments and ideas in it. The idea that Shadow being betrayed by humanity in the future is an interesting conflict, and the reveal that apparently it's Omega that betrays him is a cool angle too. And as much as I am a hater on this game, the part where he takes off his inhibitor rings is kind of peak. If it weren't for the tiresome time travel elements and the fact that every cutscene in this game looks like ass, I would probably just like Shadow's story. Unfortunately, it's the other two stories that really suck here. Silver's story is the better of the two remaining, but it just does not work for me at all. A big reason for that is that it straight up does not make any fucking sense. Silver's friendship with Blaze is supposed to be a massive part of his arc, and while it is kind of sweet at times, Blaze's mere presence here is a massive plot hole. Like, this just isn't the same Blaze from Sonic Rush, and that really annoys me. Blaze's backstory is pretty straightforward. She's the princess of the Soul Dimension, an alternate dimension to Sonic's. That is maybe a bit high concept, but it's not complicated. How did she not only get to the future, but to the future of what is to her an alternate dimension? I know this isn't a unique complaint, but it literally makes no sense. As someone who was already invested into Blaze's story, her role in this game pisses me off to no end. Blaze had a clear arc in Rush, and seeing that just completely ignored here is extremely frustrating.
So that blue hedgehog's the ableist trigger?
Blue hedgehog.
Blaze, you should know who Sonic is. Just tell Silver that Sonic's chill. This flaw is doubly frustrating too, because Blaze's sacrifice at the end of the game is a good plot element on paper, but falls flat for me completely because this isn't Blaze. This is some other character I've never met before who just kind of happens to look like Blaze. You know, maybe I'm being too nitpicky about this, but this game is going for such a high concept, in-depth, and serious story that I feel like the main people it would appeal to are invested Sonic fans, and invested Sonic fans are going to be annoyed by massive gaping continuity errors like getting a character's entire fucking backstory wrong. This isn't even a retcon. Rush Adventure was probably in development at the same time as 06. They just didn't give a shit. Sonic's story is the worst of the bunch. The others I think could have at least conceptually worked, but I think putting Sonic into a romantic subplot with a photorealistic human was a terrible idea from the beginning and would have never worked. I wouldn't go as far to say that romantic subplots couldn't work in a Sonic game, but they definitely shouldn't be this central to a game's story. The thing that annoys me more though is that I like the idea of Elise's character and of Sonic trying to help her open up. Elise was never allowed to actually feel and act like a normal person before this, and Sonic is a character who's all about being true to yourself and your emotions. It makes sense to pair these two characters up together. I can absolutely imagine a story where the two of them become close friends and Sonic helps Elise become a more well-rounded person working. But like a lot of other things in this story, it feels like they really miscalculated with the direction this needed to go. The scenes are so saccharine and just don't feel real at all. Sonic has none of his usual charm or personality in these scenes, and it feels like the writers were trying so hard to be poetic and meaningful that they forgot to write the characters like actual people. The entire game feels misdirected. This Final Fantasy-ass tone just is not appropriate for Sonic. The game's writing and direction is so drab and joyless. It's trying to be this fantasy epic and not a cartoon game about a talking hedgehog. There are 1,000 other complaints I can make about this game that all drag the experience down. You watch the same cutscenes like 3 times at points, which in some time travel stories is interesting, but they're so similar each time it rarely feels like you're seeing things from a new perspective, it more just feels like you're seeing them again. Elise gets kidnapped constantly and it gets old so fast. The animation looks awful, and putting Sonic's normal design next to real humans is extremely unnerving and awful. And the worst part is that I don't hate all of it. I like some of these ideas in theory. I still kind of like a couple of the scenes here, and I like Silver as a character and wish he had a better introduction to the series than this. It's genuinely a bummer to me how badly these ideas have been tarnished just due to their proximity to this trash fire of a game. Sonic 06 isn't a joke to me anymore. It's a tragedy, and the only emotion it stirs in me are pity and disappointment. Sonic Rivals marks the point, in my mind, where we go from bad stories to merely okay ones. Nothing from here on out is insulting or terribly boring or anything like that. Everything here is at least mostly functional and usually has at least a couple ideas I like. With that said, functional is the most I can say for Rivals 1's story. This is as much of an excuse plot as Sonic Colors, but unlike that game, it doesn't waste your time with bad jokes. It spends exactly enough time to establish why you're about to do whatever next fight or objective you're about to in the next level, and then gets back to the gameplay. According to timetobeat.com, the game is like 4.5 hours long if you're trying to get through it as fast as possible, and the videos I could find showing off the cutscenes for each story are less than 10 minutes long for the longest and wordiest of these stories, so like a sixth of your playtime at most will be spent reading these text boxes. Probably less if you're reading them fast or just mashing through the cutscenes. The point I'm circling around here is that brevity is, for a plot like this, a pretty big upside. If you're not going to tell a complex and grandiose story with your game, just doing the bare minimum not to break up gameplay too much is a virtue. I mean, some would argue that you just shouldn't include the cutscenes at all if you're not interested in telling a story, but I think they at least have some value here. It's a good excuse to show some more interactions between these characters, and the characters are a big draw of this series, so seeing more of them will usually be seen as a good thing. There is a bit of a problem though, and that's that the characters just don't quite feel like themselves. Most of the characters are ever so slightly off, and it's a bit hard to put a pin on exactly what the issue is. It gets more clear in Rivals 2, but the people who made this game either didn't care or didn't know that much about Sonic. Shadow in particular feels a bit out of it in these games, but again, we'll get to that in Rivals 2. Outside of the character writing, there's also a bit of weirdness with the game's villain, Eggman Negative, and no, I will not shorten his name. So his plan here is to use this camera that turns whatever it takes a picture of into a card to threaten everyone into getting what he wants, which is mostly just taking out all the heroes who threaten his plans. The issue is that he just doesn't ever do that. There are multiple scenes where he goads the heroes into chasing him by saying he'll give them a card that contains what they want if they win a race, and like, why? Just use the camera on them. What, is Sonic so massively faster than light he's gonna fucking dodge the individual photons emitted by the camera's flash or something? If there's some sort of restriction on how the camera works, it's never mentioned and never shown. He's going to use the camera to put the entire planet into a card as his final plan, so he should be able to put Sonic and his pals into one easily. It's just a really stupid plot hole. I'm aware that's a bit of a nitpick, but there's really not much else to say about the story in this game. There's not like themes and character arcs here. It's just a means to an end, but at least those means aren't offensive. The plot of Generations is just the plot of Sonic Rivals with a higher budget. It's an excuse to celebrate the history of Sonic as a franchise and nothing more, and it does that fine enough. The main things that make it better than Rivals is that the characters feel a bit more like themselves, and now they're animated and voice acted and in higher resolution. Best Girl is here, Cream got to show up in a game, so that's cool, and I think this is the first game where we got confirmation that the mainline console games hadn't given up on Silver as a character after 06, so that must have been reassuring. If it seems like I don't have much to say about this game's story, it's because I don't. Nothing of substance happens, and the little interactions when you save the characters are really short and kind of nothing. There aren't even plot holes for me to nitpick because there's no plot for me to nitpick in the first place. I almost considered not including this on the ranking at all due to how short the cutscenes are, but there is technically a story going on here, and there are fully voice acted and animated cutscenes, and that's more than what a lot of video games get. Somehow, it's more than a lot of really big and profitable video games get to this day, and I will never forgive Game Freak for this. Sonic Generations knows what it is and doesn't try to be more, and while in some sense that's disappointing, just seeing all my favorite Sonic characters again and having a game that is unambiguously fun to play is honestly enough for a game that exists as a celebration of the franchise's history, including the rough part. That's all I have to say. Let's move on to something more substantial now. Fun fact, I played the shit out of this game when I was a kid. That's not gonna save it from me though, because this game's story is not great. There are some things I like. The entire twist with Neo Metal Sonic is fun, and this is the first game to really start developing Metal Sonic as a character, which is really cool. I don't hate all of the character interactions that play when the level starts. They're at least kind of entertaining, and the little intro movies that every team gets are pretty cute. I think that's where the positive things I have to say end, though. The animation is, well, it's not awful, it just isn't good. Everything happens way too fast for some reason. It's like they didn't want to waste the player's time with too many cutscenes in between levels, so they just did everything in as few frames as possible, and most of the time it just reads as visual noise. A lot of the writing in this game is, I'll be real, just kind of bad. They kept the whole rival fight thing from the adventure games, but couldn't be bothered to make them make even close to the same amount of sense as they did in adventure. So every few levels, you just run into one of the 3 other teams and get into one of the most forced conflicts ever. Why does Amy want to use violence to make Sonic marry her? That's not a part of her character. That's stupid. Why does Rouge just assume that the Chaotix are evil for no reason? Isn't she supposed to be smart and also know a lot of things because of her history as a spy for the government? That's also stupid. I think the only good thing to come out of these scenes is the voice clip of Vector saying, "Who's this broad?"
Who's this broad?
Priceless. I know I had a lot of bad stuff to say about this game's story, but it's not like all bad. I mean, it is bad, and I generally wouldn't recommend this game for its story, but it's very similar to Sonic Rivals, where the story is mostly just there to facilitate the gameplay. It at least has a couple of ideas that are interesting and introduces Omega to the game, who is an amazing character, so I have to at least give it props for that. It sets up the whole Shadow as an android thing, which is at least a good idea for a storyline. The game's story isn't completely without merit, but so many scenes are just forced and awkward in a way that's really hard to ignore. The main reason it's this high up is that it threads the needle between not going so heavy on its story that it becomes frustrating, while also having enough story elements that there's at least something to latch onto, unlike games like Sonic Generations. So, congratulations, Sonic Heroes, you did the bare minimum. Have a gold star. Shadow the Hedgehog is very similar to Sonic Forces in that it wants to be way darker than it actually is, purely to the game's detriment. However, unlike Forces, Shadow the Hedgehog at least has some amount of dignity. It fully commits to the bit and actually puts some amount of time and effort into developing its themes. There is a genuine attempt to examine Shadow as a character and the different paths you could go down, and it's interesting conceptually. I want to emphasize the conceptually part there, that's very important. It's really obvious how much this game is leading into the idea of identity and what it means, as everything that happens in this story relates to Shadow's identity and his struggle to accept who he is. Whether it be him being an omnicidal android, the right-hand man of alien Satan, or a hero alongside Sonic, Shadow is whoever he chooses to be, and that is the ultimate revelation he comes to. On all of the other story paths, it kind of feels like Shadow is being forced to go down each of these roads by another character, constantly yanked around and told what to do. It's only in the final story that Shadow does what he wants to and comes into himself, and that is, on paper, a really interesting way to tell a story. It just doesn't work because the tone is really out of place, the writing is awful, and the structure of the game itself doesn't lend itself to the story it's trying to tell. There are just so many examples I can use as to why this game's story and writing are bad. This game is a fucking treasure trove of out-of-context clips. I literally have too many to show you.
You've got to be kidding me, guys. This is like taking candy from a baby, which is fine by me.
Everything that happens in this game is ridiculous, but not in a fun, cheesy way. It's ridiculous in a way too sincere, kind of cringe, edgy way that makes it really hard for anyone to take it seriously. The story paths feel too flexible for me as well. I feel like you should have maybe 1 or 2 decisions at the start of the game that decide what path you go down, but instead you have 3 missions you can do for every level that will pilot you through the levels in wildly different orders. I'm pretty sure you can do 2 evil or hero missions and then beeline across the morality spectrum and get the hero or villain ending, which feels like it shouldn't be possible given that you supposedly just betrayed the opposite group on those first 2 missions. It makes following the actual events of any storyline in particular really confusing, and makes it feel like the final ending you get is really the only plot beat that matters. That kind of sucks because it takes the process of self-discovery out of this story of self-discovery. Like, every time there's an ending where Shadow declares that this is who I am, outside of the final ending just feels completely hollow because it doesn't feel like Shadow made any real decisions throughout the game. And I guess you could argue that that's on purpose to show that only the true ending is the real version of Shadow, but that just feels really stupid to me. This is Shadow the Hedgehog 2005. They were not purposely making these endings feel weird to make a statement on Shadow's character or some avant-garde bullshit. All this together makes the game's story feel like kind of a mess. Nothing in it really quite works, and even keeping track of what's going on and what you're doing can be a real headache. And with all that said, I still kind of fuck with it. Like, it's not good, but the ideas it has for Shadow's character make so much sense given his story up to this point that I can kind of overlook how bad it is. There are even a few scenes that I actually kind of like. The scene where the commander holds Shadow at gunpoint and says he'll get revenge for his family comes really close to working for me. It's not quite built up properly, and if you weren't a massive fan of the games like I am before it happens, it probably would feel kind of out of nowhere, but with all of that context, this feels like a pretty effective scene for showing these two getting over their differences in a way that feels somewhat natural given their previous characters. The only thing that I really don't like about this game is Black Doom. He's just really lame and not a cool villain. Also, his design sucks. But with all that said, I don't hate this game's story, I just wish it was better. Okay, I think I might get some pushback for this, but I was not impressed with Sonic Unleashed. It's fine, and the opening cutscene is legitimately super sick, but everything after that is just mediocre. I think the main reason why I didn't love this story is that Chip never really grew on me as a character. I just never found his antics endearing or funny, so him being pretty central to the story is obviously going to present a bit of a problem. Chip is just the standard peppy kid sidekick character, but without any of the actual humor that the good versions of this character come packaged with. In a lot of scenes, he's just kind of there. Like, he doesn't even say anything or add to the scene, he's just sitting there. I understand why people say the scene where they revealed Chip's real identity is emotional and poignant, but it just didn't quite land for me. It just felt really weird for Chip to suddenly be so down to earth and serious after him basically being a baby for the entire game. And I get that's because he remembered everything now, but it just didn't feel earned. I understand why the scene works for some people, but it did not make me feel anything. The idea of the whole light and dark Gaia in this cycle of death and rebirth is an interesting idea and a bit of lore I enjoy having in the Sonic universe. The main issue I have is that it doesn't feel like it's used that well thematically. You'd think having Sonic get infected by dark Gaia would lead to some sort of plot development, but it barely ever gets brought up. Like, I get that the point is that Sonic is incorruptible and he'll never give in to temptation, but I feel like we should at least see some of that temptation. Shouldn't being forced into the Werehog form affect Sonic at least a little bit? The only time I think it comes up at all is that one scene with Amy where she doesn't recognize him as Sonic anymore, but that doesn't go anywhere. The ending also just feels really heavy-handed. Like, thank you, Professor Pickle, I really need you to just tell me the themes of this game. I am a stupid baby who can't think for myself. I do at least like the overall art direction for the game. The tone is a lot closer to what a Sonic game should be. I think the more cartoony look for the humans makes way more sense for this franchise. I mean, Eggman is a cartoony looking human. He's been in this franchise since the beginning. Even the more high fantasy concepts don't feel that out of place despite requiring a lot of exposition. I can totally believe that some bullshit like this exists within Sonic's universe. I haven't been sounding super positive about this game's story so far, but I think highlighting the type of criticism here is pretty important. It's not that the story is completely incompetent or misplaced in terms of basic direction, or barely even there like a lot of the games below it. It just doesn't quite stick the landing for me. The complaints here are about a lack of thematic relevance in certain points, or that the humor didn't work for me, not something so critical as to make the story here overall bad. The story of Sonic Unleashed is pretty solid for a video game. While I do think we can do better and should ask for better, I don't dislike what was shown off here by any means. Oh, thank God this one has voice acting. Anyway, the story of Rivals 2 is basically Rivals 1, but what if we actually tried this time? Instead of having 4 stories following one character, you have 2 stories following teams of characters that are connected to each other in some way. And overall, I like all of the pairs of characters they chose. They make a lot of sense. I swear the Silver and Espio pairing makes more sense once you start to think about it. Adding a second character to each story really does a lot for this game, as it gives all of these characters someone consistent to bounce off of. Instead of just running into a new rival every couple seconds again and do a stupid, unnecessary argument, they each have a partner who they consistently talk to about their thoughts and goals. It's pretty easy to see the effect that it's had on the game, as the length of the cutscenes has basically doubled from the last game to this one. It's nice to get another adventure with all these characters and to get to see some character interactions that we wouldn't normally be able to see. Unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. As I alluded to earlier, a lot of the characters feel a little bit out of it in some small ways. Shadow probably gets the worst of it, and I mean, when has Shadow ever been written consistently? He picks a fight with Rouge, despite the fact that at this point they should be friends or at least on okay terms with each other. He works with Metal Sonic, and that feels kind of weird too. I mean, I get it, they're both artificial beings who are rivals to Sonic, so making a connection between them makes thematic sense, but that doesn't mean it makes sense for Shadow to work with him directly. He still doesn't like Eggman, and I don't know why Shadow would work with him here. Like, I think after the events of Heroes and Shadow the Hedgehog, there would at least be some animosity there. Rouge is also a lot dumber here than I think she should be. Like, why would she take a job from someone when they won't tell her their identity and are asking for something this precious and suspicious? Were you really gonna hand the Chaos Emeralds over to a random nobody you had never met? Still, these issues aren't enough to make me dislike the game's story. It's really nice to get to see more of these characters, and anytime we get to see some more from randos like Espio or characters who get overlooked a ton, like Metal Sonic and Silver, I'm gonna be pretty happy. Espio and Silver in particular are really interesting here because we so rarely get to see these characters outside of their normal groups. Espio is always hanging out with the Chaotix, and Silver is usually around the other main characters or Blaze, so seeing them interact with each other really serves to highlight parts of their personality that don't normally get to shine. Silver here feels like he kind of steals the show instead of clashing with personalities like Sonic and Shadow that normally overpower his presence, and Espio is very different here to how he's normally written. Instead of pretending to be aloof, he kind of takes a more supporting role, which we rarely get to see from the guy. I think this is the most interesting story of the group just because it highlights such a unique set of characters. You know, we could see a lot of Sonic and Tails and Knuckles and Rouge interacting already. But Espio and Silver are a bit of a rare pair to see interact. It probably seems insane for me to put this over Unleash, but I just really don't like Chip, guys. He was so fucking annoying. Yeah, Rivals 2 is basically just Rivals 1 again, except this time it has voice acting and the character interactions are sometimes actually cool. Well, this game certainly does get some points for trying. The whole storybook angle is a bit weird, but it opens up a lot of ground for more simple and straightforward storytelling without tripping over the toes of canon, so it makes a good amount of sense what you think about it. The comic-style cutscenes generally look pretty nice and are a good middle ground between the fully animated cutscenes that were expensive and at this point in the series they hadn't quite nailed down how to make look good, and just putting up some PNGs with a text box. Of course, the most ambitious part of the story are its themes. It's made pretty obvious over the course of the game that Shara, Sonic's companion, and the villain of the game, the Eraser Jin, were far closer than Shara initially led on. The implication is likely that they were in a romantic relationship in that as Eraser's ambitions grew and grew, their relationship likely soured. Shara's feelings for Eraser are obviously pretty complicated, and dealing with them well would be pretty important for this game's story. So of course, after basically killing her boyfriend, Sonic drops one of the most infamous lines in the history of the franchise.
Shara, will you grant me one more wish? I wish for a mountain of handkerchiefs. Now, just let yourself cry, as much as you need to. You'll have plenty of handkerchiefs to help you through it.
So much has been said about this line and why it sucks and what the intent was, and I do think the idea here is really sweet. he's trying to say that he's going to be there for as long as Shara needs emotional support to overcome what she's going through. And that's a nice sentiment, but god damn, is this line just awful. It really ruins what would have otherwise been one of the better stories told in a Sonic game. Of course, I'm not ranking this so low just because the ending was kind of ruined by a bad line. The rest of the plot leading up to this is just not all that interesting. We get to see a bunch of Sonic characters as different characters from Arabian Nights, and that's kind of fun, but they don't get to do all that much. It's cute, and this game is definitely a bit more of a series of small fun adventures as opposed to one overarching narrative similar to the source material it's riffing off of, but I do wish we got to see more of the extended cast here. That's a complaint I have with the storybook series in general. It kind of sucks that we don't get to see anyone besides Sonic in their true forms in either of these games. Still, it's kind of cute to see them presented in a new way at least. I just wish they were developed a bit more. Unfortunately, the final complaint I have about this game is that I just never really got invested in Shara as a character. I'm not sure why, but even without the final line blowing the landing of the story, Shara's emotional journey just didn't quite hit me the same way other stories from this franchise have. I really wish they had revealed that Shara and Eraser Jin were together earlier in the story rather than at the tail end of it. It would have given us, the audience, a lot more time to process what Shara is going through and to really empathize with her struggle. Overall, Seven Rings is a pretty functional story that isn't annoying or poorly written or anything, but it does stumble on the execution of its best ideas, and that's a real shame. Shattered Crystal is Rise of Lyric, but funny. There's not much else to say about it beyond that. At this point, they had gotten the memo that Boom was supposed to be more comedic in tone and leaned into that a lot more to make the experience so much more tolerable. It does have a few flaws that come from it being, well, Rise of Lyric, but again. Lyric is a shitty villain. He's not cool or funny or interesting, which are the three things that I think a cartoon villain can be, so he fails on all fronts. At least he's not in the game very much, so he doesn't waste too much of your time this time around. Though, the biggest flaw in my mind is that Amy gets kidnapped right away, so you don't get to see her bounce off of the rest of the cast. They had Styx replace her, and Styx is great, but her dynamic with the other characters is completely different to Amy, so she's not a replacement for her by any means. It really sucks, because I like Boom Amy. I think she's really funny. It also makes the game feel a bit hollow that one of the 4 core characters just isn't there. Still, there's nothing here that's all that bad. It doesn't do anything special, but it's one of the few Sonic games so far where I can say I actually consistently enjoyed the cutscenes as opposed to dreading them. I know I haven't really gone into that much detail about this game, but it's a comedy. There's not a ton to say about it besides it's funny or it's not funny. The game's story is generally at least pleasant to get through, and it made me laugh a few times, and I do value comedy pretty highly when it's done well. Honestly, this game makes me wonder how the Boom series would have done if Rise of Lyric had this kind of writing in it. We can only dream, I guess. I have very mixed feelings about the story in Sonic Adventure, but I also have mixed feelings about Sonic Adventure in general, so I guess that fits. Mixed bag is a fucking understatement when it comes to this game. The adventure games have, in my opinion, some of the absolute best and worst stuff in the entire Sonic franchise in them, and Sonic Adventure is a great example of that. This was one of the first really ambitious things the Sonic franchise did with its story. It had put effort in before, sure, but those stories were things that the franchise had already done before, just better this time. The jump to 3D was insane, and making fully animated, fully voice-acted cutscenes is something that even Nintendo didn't try to do. And maybe there was a reason for that. Still, the stories in this game are really sweet, and the longer I've been a fan of this franchise, the more I've come to enjoy them. Even if I don't love all of the stories here, or even like a lot of them, they add a ton to the characters by their mere existence. Almost every character goes through a pretty meaningful arc here that gives their appearance in future games a lot more depth. Tails starts to grow into his own person, Amy starts to become more independent, and we learn a lot of really interesting lore about the Echidna tribe that paints Knuckles' character in an entirely new light. And for what it's worth, Gamma is a pretty interesting character as well, and I'm still surprised they actually had the balls to kill him off for good. I also love that you can see other characters going through their stories while you play as a different character, like being able to see Sonic and Tails waiting outside the casino and whatnot. It makes the place you're playing in feel so much more alive. Unfortunately, on the other end of all this cool stuff, we have the cutscenes themselves, all of which are just bad. I mean, is there anything else for me to say here? These things were being clowned on before I was born. You already know why these cutscenes are bad. It's the topic that's been beaten to death several times over by now. Now, I have mixed feelings about how to rank this game because I enjoy it a lot more than I feel like I should. All the cutscenes have a sort of so bad it's good charm that makes me genuinely love them, but I can still find the other story elements here really impactful and can take the character arc somewhat seriously. And that's not something I think anyone who isn't a Sonic fan already would ever be able to agree with. If you don't already care about these characters, seeing these cutscenes will only make you want to mock the series more, not anything else. Should I really rank this game over something like Secret Rings that is overall a more competently put together story just because I can look past how bad these cutscenes are? Is that really fair to the artist who made all of those other games? Well, I'm not sure if it's fair or not, but it is how I feel. I do still really like this game's story despite how heavily flawed it is, and I genuinely want a remake or something of the adventure games just to see how the story would look if it were told with more modern technology. It's not objective to rank this game so high, but it is honest, and that's really the best I think I can do here. Okay, this shit is pure bias. I'm not even gonna try to justify this one. I love Shadow, I love Rouge, I love the stories they would go on to tell with these characters. I love the lore that Gerald and Maria add to the series. I love these cutscenes for being so goddamn jank, and I can't watch them without quoting the fandom, and I will not apologize for that fact. This game is so good that even when it sucks, it's still good. I didn't even grow up with this game, but there's something about it that still really appeals to me. I think it's probably that this is the first time you can see a lot of things that became my favorite parts of Sonic canon, but the cutscenes here are a lot better than SA1. They overall look a lot better, and the writing isn't awful for the most part. The main issue is that the audio mixing here is the worst shit ever, but I love that and I will not be ashamed. Adventure 2 hits a perfect middle ground for me where it's so bad that it's good, but the cutscenes aren't quite bad enough that I can't take them seriously if I want to. I cannot tell you how much of my enjoyment for this game is ironic and how much of it is sincere, and that also applies to this game's story. The main thing that I don't love about this story is that Maria kind of sucks in this game. Okay, hear me out. I like Maria as a character, and I don't hate the idea of her in this game, but the scene where she dies is just so over the top and self-serious that I actually can't get invested in it. And that really sucks because it makes Shadow's arc throughout this game a lot worse. Shadow is a character I really love, and I do like his backstory and journey throughout this game, but it doesn't quite hit me emotionally in Adventure 2. Intellectually, I can understand what they're going for, and I think it's a pretty good way to get these kinds of themes across in a game aimed at a younger audience. But I just can't quite get as invested in it as I want to, and I feel like a lot of my enjoyment of his story comes from already being invested in his character from other pieces of media. Adventure 2 is a bit of a guilty pleasure for me, and its story is a ton of fun, even if it doesn't quite work perfectly. Again, I want a remake of these games really badly. I can only imagine how they'd look with a bit of extra love and polish. Please, Sega, you would make so much money. Please just remake these games already. This is a game about Blaze, and that automatically makes it peak. Okay, bias aside, I do like Rush Adventure story a good amount. Marina's a character I really like, and it's fun to watch her grow up a little bit. It's always great to see more of Blaze, and I do love the idea of Blaze having her own sidekick. Blaze and Marine have a nice dynamic, and it makes me really sad that we haven't ever actually gotten another Rush game. The story here isn't particularly deep, but it's cute and it never felt overbearing to me. It takes enough time to tell its story and to allow us to get accustomed to this new world. And by the way, this is the only game I think that we've seen the Soul Dimension, and that really sucks because it's such a cool setting. It has this sort of Wind Waker-esque seafaring adventure vibe that's really fun, and I'm really sad that we haven't gotten to see any more of it. Still, there are a few problems. Marine, as much as I love her, does get a little overbearing by the end of the game. She's really irresponsible and kind of annoying at a point. I feel like we're supposed to be a little upset with Blaze when she calls Marine a nuisance, but I mean, she did kind of have it coming. I know that this is a setup for her arc, but that arc isn't done as well as I'd like. The main thing Marine has to learn is her limitations. She is still a kid, and while it's fine that she wants to go out on an adventure, she can't put herself and others in the way of danger to do that. So of course, to learn from this mistake, she goes out recklessly and puts herself and others in danger. But this time, she does something useful, which teaches her that she has stuff to learn still. How does this character arc make sense? Shouldn't she have put herself in danger at some point and gotten scared, or realized that she could have gotten herself or someone else hurt, and then make an effort to grow up and then prove her worth afterward? This is how you do an arc if you wanted Blaze and Sonic to learn to trust Marine more, but it's never portrayed like that. It feels like the lesson Marine learns is completely unrelated to the events of the game. Also, Captain Whisker sucks and is not a good villain. He is unimaginably lame and not threatening at all, and so is Eggman Negative, so that's not helping things there much either. Whisker repeatedly fucks up basic tasks for comedic effect, but it's not particularly funny, so it just makes him look like an idiot. At least Eggman proper is here, so we at least have one good villain in this game. Oh, I guess there's Johnny too. He's fine. This game's plot has some holes in it, but I found the journey itself fun enough that I didn't mind it that much. Still, it does mean that I can't rank it over any of the games above it because they are legitimately actually good. Oh well, look, it's the first classic style game on this list, and one of like 2 that have enough story for me to rank. I'll be real, I think this game might be this high just because I find Trip really cute and I liked her in this. Classic era stories are really simple and there's not much to say about them. It's all done through character acting in the game, and Superstars looks fine and the cutscenes that tell its story are pretty effective. The only thing that's really worth talking about are the problems with the story, and there are more here than there should be. The final boss, being the Black Dragon, isn't really foreshadowed despite it being a pretty big plot point. The only foreshadowing I think is this picture that shows up the opening cutscene. I feel like they should have been set up a little bit more beforehand. Also, this is a bit of a weird complaint, but this game got an entire comic miniseries which I've read and did enjoy, but it basically doesn't come up at all in the game. This comic establishes that Fang now has the Warp Topaz, a gem that was introduced in the IDW comics, but that just doesn't come up in the plot of Superstars at all. So, thanks for pausing the main comic for 4 months to develop this plotline that goes nowhere, apparently. The final thing I have against Superstar's story, if you want to put it like that, is that the scope of this story is pretty small. That's not necessarily an issue with the game itself. I mean, Generations is one of the most beloved Sonic games ever, and it has basically no story at all, but we are talking specifically about the story in these games right now. Considering the modern day landscape of video games, this kind of storytelling is just not that impressive. It's good, but the medium has come a long way. The story of Superstars is still really cute and effective, and it did enhance my enjoyment of the game, so I can't diss it too much, but it has some things holding it back. Hey, so you remember how Shattered Crystal is like Rise of Lyric, except Amy gets kidnapped and it's actually funny? Well, Fire and Ice is Shattered Crystal if Lyric wasn't in it and Amy was there for the whole game. That is to say, it has the best story of any Boom game and the one that is most obviously interested in making the audience laugh. It's great to have all 5 of Boom's cast together and going on an adventure in one of these games, finally. It also seems to have a way higher production value than Shattered Crystal, with the story being told in fully voiced cutscenes instead of the visual novel style of storytelling of Shattered Crystal. And for a game that's so comedic, this is a great choice. The comedic timing is pretty good here, and well-told jokes in video are generally funnier than a good joke that's written in plain text. The performance of an actor can really help sell a bit and make it more enjoyable. And these are great voice actors. The Boom cast is amazing, and I honestly think Styx works best in video format. Futterman does a great job portraying her insane ramblings, and the timing she brings to the role makes the insane shit they have this character say way funnier. I feel like the writing here is generally better as well. It's basically an episode of the TV show, but in the video game form, and that's basically all anyone ever wanted. I don't have too much else to add. The game is funny. It has a goal and it does it well. No one is missing, the villain is Eggman and he's actually good in Boom, and generally speaking, there's nothing in this game's story that's bad. That's all I have to say, let's move on. Sonic Rush is, I think, the closest thing we've gotten to a modern version of a classic storyline, if that makes any sense. It uses the modern era designs and writing for all the characters, but it's a very simple story for a 2D game. It has the same vibes as most of the classic era games and storylines do, but with actual dialogue and with the design sensibilities of 2000 Sonic. And it pulls all this off pretty well. Obviously, I love Blaze, and I think her arc in this game is generally really well done. Her friendship with Cream is cute and feels really natural, and her conflict with Sonic doesn't feel forced at all. She's also an interesting character foil for Sonic, a character who's defined not by their lack of restrictions as Sonic is, but by the amount of responsibility that's been put onto them. It says a lot about both of their characters without having to explicitly tell the audience too much. The only time that I feel like the game is pushing the characters to act in strange ways for the sake of gameplay is at the very end when you finally have the fight between Sonic and Blaze. Here, I think Blaze is being maybe a bit too stubborn. I feel like things may not have actually quite escalated to this point if this were like a TV show or something. They'd have an argument, sure, but I don't think they'd be throwing hands. The only other writing snag is that I feel like Blaze changes her mind a bit too quickly at the end of the game, considering that she literally just punched Sonic in the face because of her pride a few minutes ago, but like, this isn't Shakespeare, it's fine. The only other issue is that Sonic doesn't have much to do in this game. This is a trend with Sonic games where Sonic doesn't really have much adventure to go on, and it's always the other character stories that are the interesting parts. Still, he is written pretty well here. His interactions with Blaze are really good once you actually do get to him. All the dialogue in this game feels natural for these versions of the characters. Knuckles and Amy do get done a bit dirty, but this wasn't the first game to Flanderize them, so whatever. The point is that by the end of the game, Sonic and Blaze's friendship actually does feel earned. The worst part of this game's story is probably just that it has Eggman negative in it, honestly. Sonic Frontiers is a good video game and I will not apologize. I know that there are a lot of people who have criticisms of this game's story and gameplay, especially its gameplay, but I really enjoyed it. I mean, I think it's a better open world game than Breath of the Wild, but y'all aren't ready for that conversation. To focus explicitly on the game's story, I really like how all the characters are written here. I've defended the writing of this game before, but I don't feel like the way they're portrayed here is out of character or too low energy or anything like that. It suits the tone of the game perfectly. I like that these characters are able to take things a bit slower when need be. It really makes it feel like they've matured a lot over the course of all these adventures. Sage is a great addition to the cast, and her interactions with Eggman are perfect. It humanizes Eggman in a way that we haven't really seen since a few implications of his family history back in Sonic Adventure 2, and even then, those were only implications. The writing of all these scenes is also great. Some of the better writing in the series, in my opinion. The conversations all feel natural, which is not at all a given in this franchise, and they build toward the arcs that the characters go through in believable ways. I can totally see actual friends having conversations like these. There are some lore implications here that are interesting, but not my favorite. That Chaos Emeralds coming from space just feels like it muddles the environmentalist messages of the franchise. It was cool that Sonic used the power of Earth to fight back against Eggman, but now that message isn't as clear, but maybe I'm just being too protective of the lore here or something, I don't know. The biggest issue here, if I were to say that there was one, is just the lack of scope for the plot. Again, this story is mostly just Sonic and his friends talking about their issues, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does shift the focus in a way that I could definitely see some people not liking. Not to mention that it does make the plot a bit less ambitious until the end of the game when the end finally makes its appearance. For a series where the plots tend to try to aim a bit higher with its stories, it almost feels a bit safe, which is weird because it aims for such a dark tone that doesn't feel like it matches the rest of the Sonic franchise. I think it works here, but again, I know a lot of people aren't a fan of it. Overall, though, I don't have that many criticisms of the game's story. The cutscene animation isn't as expressive as it could be. There are a couple of scenes that don't work as well as they could, but it's a good story by the standards of this industry. But once again, I feel like we could and should be asking for more. 3 and Knuckles really shows the power of a well-executed idea. While the story here is minimal, it's done in such an interesting way given the limitations of the medium at the time. We get introduced to Knuckles, go around Angel Island and learn more about him through that environment, and if you do enough poking around, you'll get to see the true ending where Eggman betrays Knuckles and Knuckles helps you defeat him. It's a very simple story, but again, for the time it was released, this was pretty impressive. Mario certainly wasn't doing anything like this at that time. I feel like it's pretty comparable to Super Metroid's methods of storytelling, which is a great comparison to make because I think Super Metroid is kind of the gold standard for storytelling in this era of gaming. Games like A Link to the Past also have stories that are a bit more in-depth and have more lore, but I think that 3 and Knuckles is actually still a better story just because of how it's told. Similar to Super Metroid, outside of the intro and manuals providing additional context, all of the story in 3 and Knuckles is told through gameplay and small cutscenes, and that means that you never really get taken out of the experience. Zelda games have always been in a weird middle ground to me where they have too much dialogue to really let you get engrossed in the gameplay and world completely, but not enough to establish strong characters and plot lines in a more traditional way. It's a bad middle ground to be in, and one that future Sonic games unfortunately found themselves in as well. Sonic 3 and Knuckles, with its very simple cutscenes and storytelling, avoids this problem by leaving everything except the broad strokes to your imagination, and that's a great way to tell a story in a 16-bit format. And I can only imagine how cool this must have been as a kid. It is the same kind of exploration that Super Metroid has in some ways, and I promise I'll stop using that as a point of comparison now, but it's not like a selling point of the game. Sonic was a pretty linear series of games for the most part, so knowing that there was this entire plotline hidden just out of sight if you actually went through the trouble of getting all of the Chaos Emeralds it had to be really cool before the internet was super common. This is one of the only times that those playground rumors turned out to actually be real, right? It reminds me of stuff like Ella's real and all the other stuff in Mario 64, but this time it's not complete bullshit. I have to imagine that this experience is a lot like mine when I was going through Ocarina of Time as a kid. My family was too poor for consistent internet access, so I had to go up to the library and Google guides to help me throughout that game. And man, when I found some of that stuff in that game, it felt so crazy. I couldn't believe what was hidden in there. There's not a lot for me to complain about here, you know? The game's story is ambitious for the time, and it sticks the landing perfectly. The only thing holding it back is that, it is a 16-bit game. It's impressive given the technology of the time, but I mean, it's been 30 years, guys. The medium has moved on since then. And while too few Sonic games have surpassed the simplicity of 3 and Knuckles, that's not to say that none of them have. Full disclosure, this is the game that kind of got me back into Sonic again after falling out of the franchise throughout the 2010s. It kind of blew me away just how good everything in this game is, and that includes its story. Before this game, I understood conceptually what Shadow's character was and why some people really loved him as a character, but this is the first time that I really got it. Shadow getting another chance to meet Maria and Gerald after knowing everything that really took place with his creation and the inevitable betrayal he faces from Gerald, and that Maria would end up tragically dying is a premise that is immediately compelling, and the writing is good enough to live up to the premise. Gerald and Maria feel way more real here than they do basically anywhere else. This is easily my favorite version of Gerald, and Maria is better here than she is in any of the other games. The only better version of Maria that I've seen is from the Sonic 3 movie. The emotions here really work, and it builds off of Shadow's development as a character in a perfect way. This is what Shadow the Hedgehog, the game, was trying to be and failing spectacularly at. It really does make Shadow feel like less of an edgy loser like he comes off in some games, and more like a tragic character who lost everything and is having to slowly rebuild his life. I only have a couple of complaints, and they're pretty minor. As much as I like what Black Doom represents as a villain for Shadow, he's just not an interesting character. His design is way too tryhard for me, and considering his only other appearance in this franchise was not impressive, trying to pull from their shared history to set him as a villain doesn't work as well as I would have liked. It works thematically, and what Black Doom represents is interesting, but his actual presence with the game isn't very fun to watch. And there's also the issue that this game just isn't quite a full story. This is an add-on to a re-release of another game, and while it has a surprising amount of content for being that, it doesn't have the time to really flesh out everything as well as I would have liked. It works as an addendum to Shadow as a character, and we get to learn a lot more about him in this game, but if you don't watch the Dark Beginning shorts beforehand and don't already know who Shadow is and buy into his character, these scenes will not work as well as they should, given that the writing is pretty solid. I mean, I could definitely see someone finding this scene with the whole "the shadow shows you where the light is" thing really silly if you don't know about these characters and their history and also care about them to some degree. I really liked that moment, but even as someone who really fell in love with this game and this character through it, it was maybe a little much. So, Shadow Generations is maybe my personal favorite story the Sonic games have told so far, but that's accounting for a lot of things that aren't in the text of the game itself. Dark Beginnings, the plot of SA2, all of these elements come together beautifully in this game, but are still not a part of it itself, and that means I don't think I can really rank it as the true number one spot. There is one Sonic game that I think tells the story pretty perfectly. And that game, the game with the best Sonic story out of any Sonic platformer is, and I can't believe I'm saying this, Sonic and the fucking Black Knight. You guys don't get the full context here. I only knew of this game from random bits of Let's Plays and reviews I had seen in the past, and I instantly dismissed it as shovelware. I haven't gotten my hands on it myself yet, and maybe the gameplay is still ass, but I never really looked into its story before trying to make this video. I just saw the gameplay footage and assumed that its story would be awful. But after going through the secret rings and being impressed with how well that game's story worked despite not looking like the best game itself, I was cautiously optimistic for this game's story, and it really blew me away. Similar to Secret Rings, this is a storybook game with a couple of full 3D CGI cutscenes, but the bulk of the story being told in these little comic book segments, and I do like the style a lot here. As I said earlier, I think the cutscenes look pretty good, and it's a pretty economic solution. However, that's where the comparisons to Secret Rings end for me. This game's opening cinematic is much better. Instead of being this moody, kind of vague thing that sets up a mystery that the rest of the story will solve, the opening cinematic is a perfect intro to Sonic as a character. It's very goofy with Sonic eating chili dogs and joking around a lot, but it fits the tone of this game super well, and honestly, I love my Sonic being corny. The characters here are a lot more interesting too. Unlike Secret Rings where the Sonic character cameos were largely superfluous to the plot, here Sonic's rivals have been repurposed into the Knights of the Round Table, and Sonic has to go to defeat them to progress that game's story. Not only does this give them higher gameplay importance, enhanced further by them being playable later on, but it also builds toward the themes of the games in a meaningful way. Each encounter is about what being a knight truly means, and while it is corny, it's a big part of what Sonic's journey in this game is supposed to be. Merlina is an interesting character, and I think the most well-remembered part of this game. I was kind of spoiled on her being a twist villain and everything, but I really like how it was handled. You get a few scenes hinting towards her ultimate motivation throughout the game, so the portrayal feels pretty earned, and Sonic helping her deal with her own fears of mortality are handled a lot better than what I expected. In a lot of ways, this game is sort of the opposite of Sonic Forces. Remember how I said that the best kids media were stories that took complicated ideas and made them more accessible to kids? That's what Black Knight is going for. It's talking about mortality, a universal field that everyone has to face at some point in their life, and wrapping it in a story that kids can understand. It keeps all of the complex emotions that this kind of theme would require, but presents it in a goofy and fun way, as opposed to pretending to be super edgy and dark and not having any emotional depth whatsoever. And yes, I did need to get another Dunkin' on Forces. I really hate that game. The main thing that really gets Black Knight to this spot is honestly just that I don't have any issues with it at all. It is a full story that you can jump into without any prior knowledge of the series. The writing is fine to quite good in a couple of places, the characters are fun, and the cutscenes look good. There is nothing I dislike about this game's story. The only thing I could complain about is that the extended cast is technically not here because we have different versions of them, but that comes with the premise, and the premise of Sonic going through the world of King Arthur is fun enough that I don't really mind. It's just good with no caveats, and that's not something I can say about the story of any other Sonic game. And so, somehow, Sonic and the Black Knight takes the top spot as the Sonic game with the best story, something that I never thought I would ever say in my life. If you have any disagreements with this video, and I imagine most people will, please leave a comment down below. I love talking about this franchise with people. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.